James Morrison was 34, a miner with a young wife and 3 children, his body already betraying him with the first signs of black lung. One morning, chest pains gripped him like iron bands, each breath a battle. The illness was slow, inevitable, but in Millbrook, inevitability was a commodity. It could be leveraged, sold, repackaged, and consumed. When Morrison visited Dr. Whitman, he expected care, perhaps compassion. What he received instead was a proposition that would shatter the very fabric of his understanding, a choice between death in his home or survival under chains, with his family financially secured. Whitman spoke quietly, ensuring no one could overhear. He outlined a path that seemed sacrificial, noble even, be declared dead, have the funeral performed with all ceremony and reverence, let the church release the promised insurance payout, and then continue your life, not freely, but under a new name, transported to remote mines where labor was cheap, regulation non-existent, and mortality high. You are dying anyway, Whitman said clinically, and this way, your family benefits, your labor serves a purpose, and you endure a few years of hardship while protected from destitution. The weight of the decision crushed Morrison. It was not a question of morality, but survival, for him and his family. With every measured word, Whitman dismantled Morrison's understanding of right and wrong, replacing it with necessity and obligation. Trust in the doctor and the church, in the promise of salvation, became chains invisible yet unbreakable. Morrison agreed, believing he was acting out of love, making a final, ultimate sacrifice. He had no idea that sacrifice would be a lifetime of bondage, an existence that would erase him from the world he knew. The funeral was staged with precision. Samuel Crowe prepared a coffin weighted with stones to mimic human mass, arranging it so that anyone glancing inside would see only what they expected, a body, lifeless, gone. The service was elaborate, emotionally overwhelming, and meticulously orchestrated. Reverend Thompson preached of providence, of God's mysterious ways, of the honor in selfless sacrifice. Family and friends wept, feeling relief, gratitude, and grief intertwined. No one suspected deceit. Once the ceremony ended, Morrison was transported under guard, his identity erased, his fate bound to the unregulated mines in western Pennsylvania. There, miners died in cave-ins, explosions, and from disease, their bodies often never recovered, their names forgotten. Morrison's life continued, yes, but as a ghost in a living world, an invisible, exploited laborer whose existence was ignored by law, ethics, and society. This was the beginning of the Millbrook method, a system so precise, so ruthless, that desperation became the medium through which trust, faith, and grief were weaponized. One man's sacrifice became the blueprint. One coffin of stones became the pattern repeated hundreds of times over the next 15 years. And yet, no one outside the inner circle knew. After James Morrison's disappearance, the system shifted from opportunistic to methodical. Thompson and his allies had discovered the perfect formula: target the desperate, exploit trust, stage death, and transport the dead to labor that no one would monitor. Each step was choreographed to prevent suspicion. The life insurance payouts created an illusion of providence, a tangible proof that God's church cared for the widows and children. Meanwhile, the reality was far darker. The victims were living, enslaved, and expendable. Dr. Whitman became the quiet architect of selection. His medical practice gave him intimate knowledge of who was ill, who was injured, and who had debts crushing them into hopelessness. Regular checkups, framed as preventive care, were actually screenings, evaluations of suitability for the Millbrook method. Men with progressive illnesses, accidents that rendered them unable to work, or families in financial ruin were carefully flagged. Their vulnerabilities made them ideal candidates. Thompson's sermons reinforced obedience and gratitude, his words framing the impending disappearance as a moral act, a sacrifice for the greater good of family and God. Samuel Crowe, the Undertaker, honed the art of convincing death. Each coffin was filled with weighted stones arranged meticulously to replicate the deceased's size and shape. Crowe developed a shorthand for simulating decomposition, using rags, sawdust, and oils, explaining away discoloration or rapid deterioration to grieving families. Funeral services were psychologically engineered to overwhelm mourners, elaborate hymns, impassioned sermons, ritualized grief, all designed to focus attention on emotion, not detail. The ritual itself became armor for the deception. Thompson, Whitman, and Crow created a seamless chain: church, medical oversight, burial, and transportation. Once the victims were declared dead, contractors delivered them to isolated mines in western Pennsylvania. These mines were beyond regulation, their operators unconcerned with the names or backgrounds of the men, only with the labor they could extract. Deaths were frequent, inevitable, and largely unnoticed. The victims' identities ceased to exist, they became commodities, invisible yet productive. The brilliance of the Millbrook method lay in its subtlety. It did not attack the community overtly, nor did it provoke rebellion. Faith, grief, and desperation were manipulated as tools of control. No records were kept of the men's true locations, no investigations dared challenge a church, a doctor, or an undertaker whose reputation was impeccable. And as the years passed, more men vanished under the same pattern, each case reinforcing the system's credibility and efficacy. By 1870, the operation was fully refined. Dozens of men had been transported under false death, their families none the wiser. The network was precise, ruthless, and virtually invisible, a shadow system exploiting the vulnerabilities of a trusting town. It was a darkness hidden in plain sight, and Millbrook was only beginning to grasp the scale of what had been wrought in the name of faith. The first cracks in the illusion appeared not in documents or sermons, but in fleeting, impossible glimpses. Thomas McKenna, a miner hardened by years underground, swore he saw James Morrison trudging along the railroad tracks 3 weeks after his funeral. Thin, haggard, dressed in work clothes, Morrison moved with a peculiar limp that McKenna knew too well. He called out, no response. By the time he reached the spot, the figure had vanished into the morning mist. McKenna's rational mind fought to deny what he'd seen, but the certainty lingered, a cold dread crawling up his spine. It wasn't just McKenna. Over the months, other townspeople reported similar sightings. Mario Sullivan claimed her deceased husband Patrick appeared at a neighboring general store, weaker than she remembered, yet unmistakably alive. Agnes Fletcher insisted she saw her late son Benjamin at her kitchen window, thinner, emaciated, but undeniably present. Each account was dismissed at first: grief-stricken imagination, poor light, coincidence. And yet, a pattern emerged. The dead were always distant, never responding, never approaching, always in neighboring towns or at the edges of Millbrook. The town's whispers reached Reverend Thompson, who offered theologically comfortable explanations. Grief manifests in mysterious ways, he told the congregation. The mind, in its desperate need to cling to what it has lost, sometimes fabricates the vision of the absent. It was rational, compassionate, and entirely misleading. For Thompson, these sightings were not anomalies, they were expected side effects, byproducts of the system he had perfected. He did not need the town to know the truth, he needed them to believe the lie unquestioningly. The reality was far more systematic. Morrison had not wandered free. He had been transported, like the others, to remote mines in western Pennsylvania, isolated, dangerous, unregulated. The miners who operated these sites did not care about names, identities, or humanity. They paid Thompson and his associates a flat fee for each able-bodied man delivered. The men received nothing beyond meager food, meager shelter, and brutal labor. Most would never return to their families, and the few glimpsed by townsfolk were glimpses of men already broken, shadows of their former selves, alive but enslaved. This was not chaos. It was architecture. Faith, grief, and desperation had been engineered into a machine of exploitation. Every sighting, every whispered story of the walking dead, served as a psychological reinforcement. The town believed in miracles, sacrifice, and providence. They did not question the machinery delivering men to unrecorded deaths. Thompson's network had reached full operational power, a system invisible in plain sight, exploiting the vulnerable, and feeding off the faith of a town too trusting to survive its own salvation. The Millbrook method was no accident. It was a finely tuned system, designed to convert desperation into compliance, grief into profit, and faith into control. Thompson understood human psychology with a precision most clergy could never dream of. He did not prey on the strong or the wealthy, he focused on the isolated, the sick, the indebted, the men whose absence would go unnoticed, whose sacrifice could be framed as noble, and whose families would receive immediate compensation. These were the perfect candidates. Dr. Whitman, the physician, became the method's analytical mind. Every medical exam, every private consultation, every health record was an intelligence report. Who was terminally ill? Who was injured and unable to work? Who carried debts that crushed their family? These were not just patients, they were inventory, carefully catalogued, assessed, and prioritized. Preventive care was a euphemism. It was surveillance disguised as charity. Whitman's authority gave him the power to recommend sacrificial arrangements with moral weight, while the men trusted him to safeguard their health and their families' futures. Samuel Crowe perfected the illusion of death. His coffins were not simply containers, they were props in a performance of grief. Stones, sawdust, and rags were arranged meticulously to simulate the deceased. Crowe developed techniques to accelerate decomposition, to explain discoloration, to prevent extended wakes. The funerals themselves became psychological operations. Elaborate services, impassioned sermons, hymns that drained emotional energy, every detail was crafted to overwhelm reason, to prevent the mind from questioning what the eyes might observe. Families left relieved, grief-stricken, and unsuspecting. The logistics extended beyond the ceremony. Contractors, paid in secrecy, transported the dead to isolated mines in western Pennsylvania, where the operators did not care about identity, only labor. There, men toiled 12 to 16 hours daily, under primitive conditions with minimal food, medicine, or safety. Cave-ins, explosions, disease, these were expected outcomes, not anomalies. And for those who survived months, their bodies and names remained erased from the town's consciousness. Thompson's genius was subtle. The church provided authority, the doctor provided legitimacy, the Undertaker provided the illusion. Trust, grief, and desperation became invisible shackles, binding both the victims and the town. By exploiting human need and engineering every step of the process, the Millbrook method transformed death into a marketplace, grief into currency, and faith into complicity. By the mid-1870s, the operation was unstoppable. One man disappeared, and a pattern was already in place for the next. One coffin of stones became hundreds. Families mourned, payouts continued, and the system became a machine, efficient, ruthless, invisible. Millbrook itself became a ghost town in its understanding, a community unknowingly complicit in its own deception. Millbrook stands as a final testament to the depths of human obedience and institutional corruption. The Church of Empty Coffins, once a beacon of faith and comfort, became a laboratory for exploitation, revealing the terrifying efficiency of combined psychological, social, and financial manipulation. Its legacy is not merely historical, it is a mirror reflecting the latent vulnerabilities in every society, every community, and every mind. What Thompson perfected was not murder, but the systematic conversion of trust into obedience, grief into compliance, and morality into profit. Each ritual, sermon, document, and handshake was calibrated to shape perception, ensuring that the machinery of deception operated invisibly. Victims became participants in their own subjugation, families unwitting collaborators, and the community a stage for moral engineering. The scale, sophistication, and audacity of this system leave a lasting question: how many other institutions operate with the same blueprint, hidden behind facades of legitimacy, care, or divine authority? The psychological and cultural consequences lingered far beyond the town. Communities fractured, suspicion became instinct, and the memory of Millbrook became both a warning and a guide. Awareness of manipulation became a survival skill. Those who understood the Millbrook method learned to see beyond appearances, to question authority, and to recognize the subtle ways power can shape human behavior. The scandal, though centered on a single church and a single town, illuminated universal truths about vulnerability, influence, and moral compromise. Even today, the echoes of the Church of Empty Coffins resonate. Authority still commands trust, desperation still drives compliance, and systems still exploit the gaps between belief, morality, and survival. The difference lies in awareness. Knowledge of the Millbrook method equips you to recognize the mechanisms before you become ensnared. This is the dangerous truth they never wanted you to see, that human perception can be guided, loyalty can be engineered, and obedience can be harvested without a single raised hand. As you step back from this story, understand that you have descended into forbidden knowledge. What you have seen is not merely history, it is a lens on the present and a warning for the future. The Church of Empty Coffins is gone, but its lessons endure, embedded in the structures, rituals, and authority systems all around us. To survive in a world built to manipulate, you must see clearly, question relentlessly, and resist the invisible levers designed to shape your mind. The last truth is simple and chilling: obedience is never neutral, and trust, once weaponized, becomes the most dangerous force of all. As the years passed, the Millbrook method evolved, learning from both successes and early cracks in the system. Thompson and his associates became increasingly methodical, refining the psychological, logistical, and financial mechanisms that had already proven devastatingly effective. Every exposure, every whisper of dissent, was analyzed and incorporated into a more resilient framework, one designed to anticipate skepticism, resist scrutiny, and maintain the illusion of legitimacy across wider populations. The selection process grew more sophisticated. Dr. Whitman's evaluations became standardized, almost clinical, creating profiles that identified not only physical vulnerability but also psychological compliance. Families were studied for social networks, financial desperation, and emotional resilience, ensuring that only those most likely to obey without resistance were targeted. Each death was no longer a random act of opportunity but a calculated conversion of desperation into profit, with minimal risk of exposure. Ritual and ceremony were optimized. Funerals became more elaborate in their emotional intensity, sermons more precisely timed to coincide with moments of grief or financial concern, and small psychological triggers embedded in routine interactions. Congregants, conditioned over years of participation, were more susceptible than ever. Suspicion became difficult, as the operation now operated not merely on fear or ignorance, but on habits, memory, and deeply ingrained social norms. The logistical network expanded beyond Millbrook, reaching neighboring towns and regions where oversight was minimal and demand for labor was high. Contractors were carefully vetted, trained to maintain secrecy, and incentivized to prioritize profit over morality. The network operated like a dark mirror of industrial efficiency, precise, scalable, and ruthless. Thompson had learned the value of redundancy. Multiple layers of intermediaries insulated him from liability, and the more complex the system became, the harder it was to dismantle. Even the moral narrative evolved. Thompson framed participation as both charity and necessity, portraying compliance as a sacred duty. Survivors who returned were subtly reintegrated to reinforce obedience in others, their presence a living testament to the success of sacrifice. Each step, each ritual, each transaction was a lesson in obedience and a demonstration of how institutions could manipulate trust, grief, and faith to extract value without overt coercion. By the mid-1870s, the Millbrook method had become a fully optimized system, a network of control, deception, and exploitation that seamlessly integrated psychological conditioning, institutional authority, and industrial demand. Thompson had not merely survived exposure, he had transformed a scandal into a blueprint for enduring manipulation. Even the most disciplined networks are vulnerable from within, and the Millbrook method was no exception. As Thompson's operation expanded, cracks began to appear, not in the design, but in the conscience of those executing it. Samuel Crowe, once utterly compliant, began to wrestle with the gravity of his actions. He had arranged coffin after coffin, performed funeral after funeral, yet increasingly, the faces of the living he had buried haunted him. Each weighted coffin, each staged ceremony, became a symbol of guilt that gnawed at the edges of his carefully compartmentalized morality. Dr. Whitman, too, confronted his role. He had rationalized the selection of victims as medical pragmatism, framing the deception as a necessary salvation for families. But as the network scale ballooned, the toll became impossible to ignore. Minors were transported farther, labor conditions worsened, and the psychological strain on survivors intensified. The systems designed to cultivate obedience were now producing suffering beyond rational justification, and the doctor could no longer pretend that his expertise excused the human cost. Whispers of dissent spread cautiously within the inner circle. Contractors questioned the ethical boundaries of their work, minor clerks documented anomalies in records, and some parishioners began noticing discrepancies that even Thompson's authority could not fully mask. Each murmured doubt was dangerous, both socially and legally, but it signaled a moral awakening within the system. Internal opposition, subtle yet persistent, represented the first real threat to the Millbrook method's unchallenged expansion. Thompson, ever astute, sensed the undercurrents. He reinforced loyalty through selective incentives, subtle intimidation, and the constant reminder that exposure would destroy lives, both his and theirs. He framed dissenters as morally weak, spiritually compromised, or ungrateful for the blessings of salvation and family provision. Yet even his charisma and psychological acumen could not entirely suppress the unease spreading among those closest to the operation. This internal tension marked a critical turning point. The network had grown too large, the human consequences too visible, and the psychological strain too heavy for all participants to compartmentalize. The first seeds of betrayal had been planted, not by the town, not by investigators, but by the very system itself, which had demanded compliance to a degree that became unsustainable. Thompson's empire of control, once thought impregnable, now faced the quiet but insidious threat of conscience. The survivors returned to Millbrook not as the men and women they had once been, but as witnesses to a truth too heavy for ordinary life. Their reintegration was fraught with suspicion, sorrow, and alienation. Families who had believed them dead struggled to reconcile joy with guilt, relief with outrage. Friends who had mourned for years now faced the reality that they had been manipulated into false grief. The psychological dissonance was profound, leaving both survivors and loved ones in a state of suspended disbelief, caught between past trauma and the tenuous hope of reclamation. The town itself bore the imprint of betrayal. Trust in authority, once absolute, was fractured. Religious institutions lost their unquestioned moral authority, while community bonds, built on shared faith and mutual dependence, were strained by suspicion. Millbrook's social fabric had been systematically corroded by manipulation, leaving a residue of fear, skepticism, and moral vigilance. Generations would inherit this cautiousness, learning early that institutions could wield belief as a weapon and that human desperation could be exploited with devastating precision. For the survivors, daily life became a delicate negotiation. Some attempted to return to work, though minds, businesses, and families now carried the weight of memory. Others became advocates, quietly educating neighbors about the mechanisms of manipulation and exploitation. Memory itself became a form of resistance, retaining names, dates, and experiences that authorities or Thompson's allies could have erased. These individuals embodied both resilience and warning, living testaments to the consequences of faith weaponized and desperation commodified. Yet trauma lingered in ways that were invisible, enduring beyond the courtroom and newspapers. Many survivors suffered nightmares, flashbacks, and deep-seated mistrust. Social interactions were tainted by the fear of deception, even the kindness of others was measured against the possibility of manipulation. These scars, though psychological, were as real and binding as the chains that had held them in the mines. They carried forward the lesson that power, authority, and morality, when co-opted by cunning minds, could create suffering in ways both overt and invisible. Millbrook, while recovering externally, never fully healed internally. The Church of Empty Coffins became a cautionary legend, its story passed down with the weight of warning. The town had seen the machinery of human exploitation operate unchecked, and the memory of it remained a silent tutor. Vigilance was survival, awareness was protection, and the shadows of authority demanded scrutiny, lest history repeat itself with equally devastating consequences. The echoes of Thompson's methods did not die with the exposure of the Church of Empty Coffins. Across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, subtle patterns emerged, schemes that mirrored the same sinister architecture of manipulation, profit, and obedience. Clergy, entrepreneurs, and industrialists observed the Millbrook scandal with a mixture of horror and pragmatic interest. They saw, distilled in Thompson's operation, a formula: identify desperation, cultivate trust, exploit belief, and monetize the vulnerability of human life. In towns with similar social and economic pressures, whispers of imitation surfaced. Miners, factory workers, and widows reported schemes that bore uncanny resemblance to Thompson's model: religious figures promoting insurance or labor programs with moral justification, sudden deaths conveniently timed to generate payouts, and the quiet relocation of workers to remote or dangerous environments. Unlike Millbrook, some of these operations remained hidden for decades, refined and adapted to local circumstances, demonstrating the terrifying portability of Thompson's blueprint for control. Historians later noted that the psychological framework of manipulation, the combination of ritual, authority, moral justification, and emotional leverage, was as important as the financial and logistical mechanisms. The Church of Empty Coffins had proven that obedience could be engineered, grief weaponized, and compliance extracted with surgical precision. These lessons, codified in Thompson's methods, informed similar schemes across industrial towns where oversight was minimal and desperation widespread. Exploitation had become a portable, reproducible system. The ripple effects extended beyond economics and labor. Communities exposed to similar models experienced erosion of trust, moral confusion, and social fragmentation. People who once relied on institutions for protection found themselves questioning every gesture of authority. Faith, charity, and loyalty became simultaneously precious and dangerous, with the potential to empower or enslave. The Millbrook method had shown the dark efficiency of combining institutional authority with human vulnerability, and the pattern repeated wherever conditions allowed. Yet, even as imitators applied Thompson's lessons elsewhere, the Millbrook story retained a unique weight, a psychological archetype of betrayal and exploitation. It became a cautionary symbol, not merely of criminality, but of the sophistication with which human perception could be manipulated. For those attuned to the subtleties of influence, Millbrook became a case study in the architecture of control, a terrifying template that transformed fear, faith, and grief into instruments of profit and obedience. The survivors returned in silence, shadows of the men who had once walked Millbrook streets. Faces hollowed by malnutrition, hands scarred by labor, eyes haunted by months spent in tunnels that seemed to stretch into the very underworld, they carried stories too horrific for casual conversation. These men were alive, yet their lives had been stolen. Names had been erased, identities replaced with numbers, families left to mourn what they believed was true. Returning to the town that had pronounced them dead was not relief, it was a psychological battlefield, where gratitude and resentment collided in raw, unrelenting waves. Many of the men struggled to reconnect with the families they had sacrificed themselves to protect. Wives had remarried or hardened under grief, children had grown into adults shaped by absence, and the social structure of Millbrook had shifted around them. The illusion Thompson had crafted had left a permanent scar. Survivors found themselves negotiating the delicate terrain of reintegration, where every interaction was a reminder of betrayal, every embrace of a loved one tainted by the shadow of manipulated faith. Even the strongest among them bore the invisible weight of guilt. Each man had chosen to vanish, to endure slavery in distant mines rather than leave his family destitute. The moral calculus had been crushing, survival versus sacrifice, obedience versus freedom. They had been convinced by a carefully orchestrated blend of authority, fear, and the promise of divine morality. And now, confronting the aftermath, they realized that the very faith they had trusted had been weaponized against them. Every sermon, every certificate, every funeral had been a tool in a machine designed to manipulate both the living and the dead. The psychological impact was compounded by physical trauma. Men bore the marks of relentless labor, collapsed tunnels, disease, and starvation. Some had lost companions in the mines, witnessing deaths that no one above ground would ever acknowledge. Memory became both curse and weapon. Each man could recount the machinery of deception in chilling detail, yet each recollection threatened to unravel their own sense of identity. They had lived as ghosts, and even in freedom, the chains of manipulation lingered invisibly around their minds. Millbrook's response was uneven. Some families welcomed the return of their men with tentative joy, attempting to reconcile loss with presence. Others recoiled in anger or confusion, unable to process the magnitude of betrayal. The town itself struggled to integrate the truth into its collective memory. For 15 years, the Church of Empty Coffins had exploited faith, desperation, and the psychological architecture of trust. Now, confronted by survivors who embodied both horror and endurance, Millbrook faced the terrifying reality that the world it had known was a meticulously constructed lie. The long-term psychological toll on the survivors was immeasurable. Men who had been declared dead lived with a dual reality, the trauma of the mines and the knowledge that the world above had continued under a lie. Nightmares came as vividly as reality, the sound of collapsing tunnels, the echo of hammers striking stone, the faces of men who did not survive. Some walked the streets of Millbrook silently, unable to speak of their ordeal, their minds haunted by the absurd horror that their very existence had been denied. Anxiety, depression, and a persistent distrust of authority became constants. The church, once a symbol of salvation, had become the origin of trauma. Families, too, bore invisible scars. Wives and children who had grieved for years faced the impossible task of reconciling love and rage. How could one forgive a system designed to manipulate faith and exploit desperation? Mothers grieved again, this time for the suffering endured in silence. Children who had grown up believing in providence learned that morality and trust could be weaponized with devastating precision. For some, anger mutated into obsession, tracking minors' return, uncovering hidden details, demanding accountability. For others, silence became self-preservation, a coping mechanism in a town that had learned to fear questioning authority. Millbrook itself was forever altered. The community's social fabric had been strained, the moral compass of the town warped by deception. Faith, once a unifying force, had been manipulated into a tool of control. Trust eroded slowly, leaving a residual paranoia that lingered for decades. The Church of Empty Coffins became a symbol of institutional corruption, its legacy imprinted on collective memory. No sermon, no charity, no ritual could undo the knowledge that human desperation had been commodified and faith weaponized. Even the investigators and journalists who exposed the operation were not immune to its psychological aftershocks. The meticulous cruelty, the deliberate engineering of deception, and the invisibility of suffering challenged conventional understanding of morality and law. They realized that human ingenuity could be harnessed not only for creation but for sustained, systematic destruction. Millbrook's tragedy became a cautionary tale. The very institutions meant to protect and guide could, under certain minds, orchestrate unimaginable horrors. Yet amidst the trauma, a flicker of understanding emerged. Survivors, families, and even some townspeople began to perceive the patterns of manipulation, the architecture of deception, and the mechanisms by which authority can exploit trust. Awareness became a shield, however fragile, a warning etched into memory. Power, when unchecked and combined with human vulnerability, can transform belief into a weapon far deadlier than any physical force. The first survivors who came forward brought stories that unsettled even the most hardened investigators. Their testimonies were raw, fragmented by trauma, yet undeniably consistent in detail. They spoke of endless tunnels, suffocating dust, the constant threat of collapse, and overseers who treated human lives as interchangeable commodities. They described the psychological torment of being declared dead while watching the world above continue without them, families mourning under false pretenses, and the constant awareness that their existence had been commodified for profit. Facing Thompson during hearings was a terrifying ordeal. The Reverend retained his calm, commanding presence, framing every accusation as misinterpretation or moral failing. He appealed to the piety of the townspeople, the legitimacy of his ministry, and the supposed benevolence of his actions. Yet the miners, visibly changed by months or years in the mines, could not be silenced. Each testimony chipped away at the aura of invincibility Thompson had cultivated, exposing the elaborate machinery that had turned grief into obedience, faith into currency, and desperation into labor. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Reliving their ordeals, recounting the conditions of the mines, the violence, the hunger, and the forced labor, triggered waves of trauma that could last for hours, days, even weeks. Some trembled as they spoke, others fell into silence, unable to articulate the horrors. Their presence alone was a rebuke to the town, a living indictment of the church's systematic exploitation. The duality of relief and anger defined every encounter, relief that they had survived, anger at what had been done to them, and profound grief for the lives of those who had not returned. Witnesses described the psychological manipulation they endured as equally punishing as the physical labor. They had been coerced into complicity, convinced that their suffering was noble, divinely sanctioned, or necessary for their families. The realization that every act of obedience had been engineered to benefit Thompson and his network provoked outrage. Trust had been weaponized, morality corrupted, and faith exploited. Their stories reveal the deep intersections of authority, deception, and survival, forcing Millbrook to confront truths too long hidden. The impact on the town was immediate and profound. Families, officials, and clergy could no longer ignore the consequences of complicity. The Church of Empty Coffins, once a symbol of divine protection, now stood exposed as a hub of cruelty, manipulation, and moral perversion. Thompson's carefully curated empire of fear and faith was unraveling, and with each testimony, the psychological scaffolding of obedience he had built began to collapse. The trials of Thompson and his associates became a spectacle that Millbrook could not ignore. Courtrooms filled with townspeople, survivors, journalists, and families desperate for answers. The air was thick with tension, grief, and barely contained rage. Every witness who stepped forward revealed a fragment of the horrific machinery that had operated for 15 years, laying bare a system that had turned faith into subjugation and grief into profit. Families who had once revered Thompson now stared at him with disbelief, horror, and moral fury. Thompson's defense was a masterclass in manipulation. He framed the entire operation as acts of Christian charity, insisting that every coffin, every payout, every labor transfer had been motivated by benevolence. He spoke of divine providence, the necessity of difficult decisions, and the moral imperative to protect families from poverty. He appealed to emotions, to loyalty, and to fear, painting himself as a misunderstood shepherd whose intentions had been pure. Yet the overwhelming weight of evidence, the miners' testimonies, the falsified records, and the accounts of families, left little room for doubt. Public outrage surged. Townspeople who had once trusted Thompson's sermons and gestures of care now realized that their faith had been weaponized against them. Anger mixed with grief as the enormity of the deception became clear. Families who had buried loved ones now mourned a second time, this time for the betrayal itself. The courtroom became a stage for collective reckoning, where morality, justice, and vengeance collided. Each detail exposed, each ledger revealed, dismantled not only Thompson's reputation but the illusions he had cultivated so carefully. Yet even as his empire crumbled, Thompson attempted to manipulate perception. He sought sympathy, emphasizing his own sacrifices and the complexities of his decisions. He whispered assurances that those removed had acted willingly, that the miners had chosen survival for their families. He tried to redirect blame, suggesting that societal pressures, industrial demands, and human desperation had forced everyone's hand. But the truth was now undeniable: the Church of Empty Coffins had orchestrated one of the most chilling and systematic abuses of trust and human life in the region's history. The trials left an indelible mark on Millbrook. They revealed the depth of manipulation, the intricate overlap of faith, authority, and greed, and the devastating consequences of blind obedience. Communities, once unquestioning, began to awaken to the mechanics of control, to the reality that institutions could exploit morality for profit. The exposure was painful but necessary, a collective awakening to the dark truths that had operated in plain sight for over a decade. In the remote mines where the dead were sent, life became a brutal calculus of survival. Men who had been declared deceased were forced to navigate a world of constant danger, extreme labor, and near-total isolation. The tunnels were narrow, suffocating, and unstable, filled with dust that choked lungs and machinery that threatened fingers, arms, and lives at every turn. Collapse was a constant specter, and the slightest mistake could be fatal. Each day was a test not just of physical endurance but of psychological resilience, as the men confronted the fact that the world above believed they no longer existed. Within this crucible of suffering, small networks of solidarity emerged. Miners communicated through gestures, subtle signals, and shared knowledge of the tunnel's dangers. Acts of quiet defiance, protecting a comrade from injury, sharing scarce food, or hiding illness from overseers, became lifelines. These micro-communities were fragile but vital, allowing men to retain a sense of identity and humanity amidst relentless dehumanization. Trust was precious, earned through action rather than words, and betrayal carried consequences as severe as any tunnel collapse. The men also developed methods of record-keeping, mentally tracking those who arrived, those who disappeared, and the flow of labor. Each name, each face, became a symbol of endurance and a warning: survival was temporary, life was negotiable, and death could be postponed but not avoided. they became experts in navigating the system imposed upon them, learning to obey without losing self entirely, to endure without succumbing to despair. Every day was both punishment and education, a grim curriculum in the mechanics of exploitation and the resilience of the human spirit. The social microcosm in the mines reflected a terrifying order. Overseers operated with impunity, labor was monetized, and men were valued only for their capacity to extract coal. The Millbrook method had transformed desperation into an industrial resource. Workers were invisible yet indispensable, expendable yet irreplaceable, enslaved in every sense except name. Despite the horror, the miners found ways to reclaim small pieces of agency, protecting one another, preserving stories, and maintaining rituals of memory that resisted the erasure imposed by Thompson's system. By the time survivors returned to Millbrook, they were not merely men who had endured extreme labor, they were witnesses to the full architecture of human exploitation. Their experience illustrated the intersection of authority, deception, and human desperation, a living demonstration of how institutional power can transform trust into a mechanism of control and survival into a testament of both suffering and resilience. Beneath the veneer of sermons, funerals, and charity, Thompson had constructed a financial empire so meticulous it rivaled any industrial enterprise of the era. The insurance payouts, ostensibly meant to support grieving families, became a revolving currency that fueled a network of exploitation. Policies were carefully calculated, premiums collected, and death certificates falsified to ensure the system remained profitable. Thompson's intimate knowledge of the community allowed him to target precisely those whose desperation made them most compliant: miners with failing health, widows with mounting debt, and families dependent on fragile incomes. Money flowed outward from church coffers to contractors who managed transportation, to mining operators who purchased labor, and back into Thompson's circle as commissions, fees, and quiet incentives. Every transaction was cloaked in legitimacy. Receipts, ledgers, and letters maintained the illusion of charity while masking the extraction of human lives as a commodity. Even local officials were complicit, whether through ignorance, intimidation, or the allure of financial gain. The system was self-sustaining, a predator disguised as salvation, turning trust and faith into a marketable asset. Thompson's financial genius lay in his understanding of perception. The outward appearance of benevolence protected him from scrutiny. Sermons emphasized morality, sacrifice, and divine reward, deflecting attention from the mechanics of money and labor. The church became a buffer, insulating the operation from legal and social oversight. Parishioners believed they were contributing to community welfare, while in reality they were unknowingly underwriting a system that traded human lives as currency. Even the most astute outsiders struggled to trace the flow of funds. Every ledger could be explained as administrative necessity, every payout justified as familial aid. Yet the empire's true scale was horrifying. Over 15 years, more than 255 men had been processed through this system. Each coffin, each certificate, each payout was a calculated step in a financial and psychological equation that transformed death into profit, desperation into currency, and faith into a tool of compliance. Thompson's understanding of human vulnerability, how grief, trust, and hope could be manipulated, made the operation nearly impervious to discovery. The intersection of money, influence, and morality created a system that was both invisible and absolute. While the miners labored in silence, and families grieved for non-existent corpses, Thompson amassed both wealth and power, his authority legitimized by the very community he exploited. The Church of Empty Coffins was not only a mechanism of physical control, it was a sophisticated financial machine built on fear, faith, and human suffering. When the truth finally began to surface, it struck Millbrook like a thunderclap. Survivors from the mines began to appear, emaciated, haunted, bearing the marks of labor so brutal it had aged them decades. They came quietly at first, slipping into town under the cover of darkness, afraid of Thompson's influence and unsure whether anyone would believe them. Each story was more horrifying than the last: men declared dead, buried in coffins of stones, transported hundreds of miles to mines where life was expendable, names erased, and the only currency of survival was obedience and endurance. Families reacted in disbelief. Mothers, wives, and children who had grieved, prayed, and believed in divine providence now confronted the reality that their loved ones had been alive, enslaved, exploited, and manipulated by those they trusted most. Emotional chaos consumed Millbrook. Some collapsed into grief, realizing they had unknowingly consented to the suffering. Others, enraged, demanded answers, revenge, accountability, but the system Thompson had built was resilient, designed to shield him from immediate consequences. His sermons had framed obedience as sacred, the doctor's certificates had cloaked disappearance in medical legitimacy, and Crow's coffins had perfected the illusion of death. Yet the town could no longer deny the evidence. Survivors described the logistical precision of the Millbrook method: selection, staging, burial, transport, and exploitation. They described the brutality of the mines: 12 to 16-hour shifts, minimal food, collapsed tunnels, frequent deaths. They spoke of solidarity among the enslaved men, secret acts of support, small defiance against the machinery of oppression, and the psychological torment of knowing their families believed them gone. Every word was a testimony to the calculated cruelty of a system hidden under the guise of faith, charity, and providence. The press began reporting on the scandal, though cautiously, aware that Thompson's reputation as a clergyman would complicate public perception. Church of Empty Coffins became the whispered moniker of St. Stephen's, a shorthand for a horror that combined greed, faith, and deception. Townspeople struggled to reconcile the image of a respected minister with the architect of systematic enslavement. Children, once raised in sermons of sacrifice and divine morality, were forced to confront a darker reality: the world could be engineered against the innocent in ways invisible, meticulous, and terrifying. The exposure of Thompson's operation marked only the beginning. Legal battles would ensue, but the human cost was permanent. Families could not reclaim their lost years, the psychological scars of betrayal were deep, and the survivors carried the weight of their experiences as living ghosts. Millbrook itself was transformed, a town no longer defined by coal and faith, but by the memory of 255 men whose deaths were fictions, whose lives had been stolen, and whose truths would haunt the community forever. The legal pursuit of justice was slow, cumbersome, and maddeningly incomplete. Courts were unprepared for a crime that spanned faith, finance, and deception on such an industrial scale. Thompson had built layers of protection, impeccable credentials, trusted authority, meticulous records, and a community conditioned to obedience and reverence. Prosecutors struggled to untangle the web: coffins of stones, falsified death certificates, contractors who vanished after transporting men to remote mines, and witnesses whose memories were fractured by trauma. Every lead seemed to dissolve under the weight of Thompson's influence. Dr. Whitman and Samuel Crow were ensnared in their own versions of culpability. Whitman, the physician who had certified death with clinical detachment, claimed he acted out of concern for families, a moral obligation twisted into justification. Crow, the Undertaker, argued that his work was merely technical, that families consented to the coffins and rituals, and that the church directed every aspect. Yet even as the law pursued them, the human consequences remained stark. Families demanded answers, miners recounted unspeakable labor conditions, and Millbrook became a town haunted not only by the dead but by the deception that had corroded trust for decades. Thompson, the architect, was a master manipulator until the end. In public hearings, he portrayed himself as a benefactor, a man who had safeguarded families from financial ruin and acted under divine guidance. Sermons, letters, and testimonials were leveraged to create doubt, delay action, and fracture opposition. He understood one immutable truth: in a society steeped in faith and deference, perception could often outweigh evidence. He relied on loyalty, fear, and social inertia, buying time while the machinery of disappearance continued quietly in the background. But cracks were unavoidable. Survivors testified with horrifying clarity, describing transportation, physical abuse, starvation, and the crushing psychological weight of a world that believed them dead. Families corroborated sightings of the living dead, painting a mosaic of horror that could no longer be ignored. The town's collective memory of trust and faith collided violently with the exposure of betrayal. Millbrook itself became a courtroom of conscience, a community forced to reckon with complicity, both conscious and unknowing. Ultimately, the legal system could hold Thompson and his collaborators accountable only partially. Convictions were secured for falsifying documents and fraud, but the full scope of human suffering, the psychological torment, the lives lived under slavery, the deaths that never appeared in records, could not be measured. Justice, in its traditional form, proved incapable of repairing the moral devastation. The Church of Empty Coffins remained a monument to the terrifying power of authority when combined with meticulous planning, human desperation, and moral manipulation. The snow fell silently over Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the bitter winter of 1879, covering the town in a white that felt almost unnatural, almost sterile. On Elm Street, behind St. Stephen's Church, the ground had been disturbed hundreds of times over the past decade, each mound supposedly marking the final resting place of a soul claimed by illness, accident, or fate. But what authorities uncovered that morning would make even the hardest men shiver. 157 coffins, opened one by one, revealed nothing but carefully arranged stones, each weighted to simulate the body it replaced. Not a single corpse. Not one fragment of human life. And yet, the church's records told a different story. Over $300,000 in insurance payouts had been issued to grieving families, astronomical sums in a town where a miner earned barely $250 a year. Every funeral, every grieving widow, every tear shed in the pews had been part of a grand deception, a machinery of control and profit so meticulously designed that no one suspected the truth. Reverend Marcus Thompson, the silver-haired man with pale blue eyes and a voice that could soothe or command, had built a system around the vulnerabilities of the desperate, the sick, the dying. He preached salvation and security while orchestrating a network that turned human tragedy into currency, grief into gold. Millbrook in 1867 was a town of shadows. 3,000 souls lived in the coal dust of abandoned mines, where explosions, cave-ins, and black lung stole fathers, husbands, and sons with monotonous regularity. Faith was the only refuge. And Thompson offered it with a smile, a promise, a church-sponsored insurance program that seemed too generous to question. The miners, isolated and exhausted, trusted him. They did not see the eyes of Dr. Cornelius Whitman, young, ambitious, and complicit, who assessed the living, identified the most desperate, and recommended which men could be declared dead without ever truly dying. They did not see Samuel Crow, the Undertaker who prepared weighted coffins, who staged funerals with such solemnity that families never suspected deception. This was a system of hidden horrors, a ritualized betrayal conducted under the guise of Christian charity. The lives of ordinary men were commodified, transported to remote mines, forced into endless labor, while their families collected payouts that were bought with their absence. The machinery was precise. The morality was warped. And it would take over 15 years and 255 victims before anyone would begin to unravel the scope of the church's sinister enterprise. Tonight, I will take you deep into the darkness, into the shadows behind the pulpit, into a world where faith was weaponized, grief was exploited, and death was a performance. You are about to see the true cost of blind trust, the mechanisms that turned a house of God into a marketplace for human souls, and the men who disappeared while the world mourned them. The first steps are small, but each one will pull you further into a truth most were never meant to confront. Millbrook, 1867, a town built on coal, sweat, and desperation. The miners woke before dawn, their bodies already aching from the previous day's toil in the pitch-black shafts. The town itself seemed tired, its streets lined with worn brick houses, smoke curling from chimneys like the breath of the dead. Into this weary world arrived Marcus Thompson, a man whose very presence suggested authority and certainty, a figure carefully constructed to inspire trust. He was 45, tall, silver-haired, with pale blue eyes that could comfort the grieving or ignite fear in the hesitant. Thompson's timing was perfect. The previous rector, Reverend Hayes, had died suddenly, leaving the Protestant miners spiritually adrift during the deadliest stretch of their lives. Families struggled to survive each day, and every death left widows destitute and children orphaned. The town was ripe for manipulation, for a man who could promise protection while orchestrating control. Thompson did not merely preach, he engineered reliance. Within his first 6 months, he had conducted 14 funerals, more than Hayes had in 2 years combined. Each ceremony carefully staged, every tear observed, every widow reassured. He was not just a pastor. He was a conductor of grief, orchestrating a symphony of trust. And then he introduced his life insurance program. It was revolutionary, or so it seemed. Families could insure their lives through a company Thompson partnered with, Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. The cost was minimal, the payout immediate. Widows were promised instant relief, families promised stability. Thompson personally handled every detail, advancing funds when needed, ensuring no family was left waiting. The combination of spiritual authority and practical assistance created a bond that was nearly unbreakable. The miners believed they were safe, shielded by divine providence and the Church's care. But this was only the beginning. Behind the veneer of salvation lurked a network of exploitation. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, young and eager, became Thompson's ally. With access to medical records and personal knowledge of the miners' conditions, he identified those most vulnerable: men with progressive illnesses, injured workers, the financially desperate. Samuel Crow, the Undertaker, perfected the illusion of death, using stones, sawdust, and rags to simulate bodies, and orchestrated funerals so convincing that families never suspected deceit. Together, these men created a system that preyed on desperation, converting terminal illness and financial despair into a methodical enterprise of disappearance. Men declared dead were not gone, they were enslaved in remote mining operations, working under false identities, their lives commodified for profit. No one outside the inner circle questioned it. Trust, fear, and grief were all manipulated with surgical precision. This was more than corruption. It was psychology weaponized. The townspeople's faith, their mourning, their need for relief, all of it was turned against them. And the machinery was only beginning to churn. The psychological aftermath of the Millbrook scandal endured long after Thompson was removed from power. The town, once tightly bound by faith and routine, became fractured, its social cohesion shattered by the revelation that the institutions they trusted had been instruments of exploitation. Survivors carried invisible scars, nightmares, hypervigilance, and mistrust of authority that extended into every aspect of life. Even decades later, families whispered of the empty coffins and the men who never truly died, stories passed down like warnings embedded in collective memory. Millbrook's cultural fabric shifted in profound ways. Religious attendance declined as trust in clergy eroded. Community rituals were questioned rather than accepted, and new generations inherited a wary skepticism toward institutions that had once demanded blind obedience. Education, governance, and local businesses all face subtle but lasting scrutiny, as citizens sought to safeguard against manipulation, remembering too well how moral authority had been weaponized. The town had internalized a brutal lesson: faith without scrutiny, obedience without awareness, was fertile ground for exploitation. The survivors themselves became reluctant teachers. Their testimonies, often whispered and carefully framed, carried the dual purpose of catharsis and warning. They described not only the horrors of forced labor but also the slow, systematic dismantling of moral agency, the subtle conditioning that had made deception almost invisible. These lessons rippled through families and communities, forming a psychological defense network built from memory, trauma, and hard-earned vigilance. Historians and sociologists later cited Millbrook as a case study in institutional manipulation. The scandal illuminated how systems could co-opt morality, exploit desperation, and convert faith into obedience. It offered a blueprint not for criminal replication, but for understanding the mechanisms by which humans are manipulated en masse, insight that remains relevant to this day, in politics, religion, and corporate structures. The Church of Empty Coffins, while exposed, continued to serve as a cautionary symbol, a reminder that power unchecked, combined with human vulnerability, produces devastation in ways that transcend the immediate victims. Millbrook became both a warning and a laboratory for understanding control. The town's trauma was a mirror, reflecting the darker capacities of human institutions and the subtle ways obedience can be engineered. Those who survived carried a moral imperative: to question, to analyze, to see beyond appearances. The lessons of Millbrook were harsh but eternal: truth is revealed slowly, and awareness is the only shield against manipulation that thrives in darkness. The Millbrook method, though exposed in Pennsylvania, did not vanish with Thompson's downfall. Its principles, exploiting desperation, weaponizing trust, and manipulating morality, became a template for other institutions, industries, and even governments. Across the 19th and 20th centuries, similar tactics emerged in labor exploitation, welfare schemes, and insurance fraud. The blueprint was clear: identify vulnerability, create dependence, embed moral justification, and ensure compliance through subtle psychological conditioning. Industrialists and bureaucrats recognized the efficiency of the system. The psychological conditioning perfected by Thompson, rituals, authority reinforcement, fear, and hope, proved replicable in factories, mines, and administrative networks. Policies were framed as benevolent, profit disguised as charity, and obedience normalized through procedural routine. Victims were rarely aware of the manipulation, and those who observed anomalies were dismissed, rationalized away, or silenced. The Millbrook method had transcended its origins, becoming a dark pedagogy in human behavior and institutional control. Even in modern corporate and governmental systems, echoes of Millbrook can be traced. Authority figures exploit social, economic, and emotional leverage, often hiding coercion behind moral, legal, or ethical facades. The mechanics remain the same: create trust, reinforce obedience, exploit vulnerability, and isolate dissent. Though the stakes may not always be life or death, the psychological patterns, the subtle erosion of agency, the normalization of deception, the emotional conditioning, are consistent. Those who understand the Millbrook model can see it at work in boardrooms, bureaucracies, and communities. The horror of Thompson's network lies not only in the physical suffering it caused but in the revelation of human malleability. Ordinary people, guided by faith, desperation, and authority, participated in their own manipulation. Awareness of this dynamic is both terrifying and empowering. It reveals the fragility of perception and the ease with which institutions can exploit trust when psychological levers are expertly applied. Millbrook became more than history, it became a lens for understanding the dark architecture of influence that persists in human society. And now, as you listen, it becomes personal. Awareness is no longer abstract, it is a weapon, a shield, and a responsibility. Recognize the patterns, question authority, and resist the subtle seductions of manipulation. For those who see, Millbrook is no longer a story of a distant town, it is a living reminder of the vigilance required to remain free in a world designed to condition obedience. At this point, type the phrase "I see the pattern" twice in the comments below, not just to mark awareness, but to anchor your identity in vigilance and insight. The first public tremors arrived not with lawsuits or arrests, but with whispers, rumors, and inexplicable anomalies. Families who had once blindly trusted St. Stephen's began to question the inconsistencies in burial records. Neighbors compared notes, noticing the improbable timing of deaths, the uncanny uniformity of sudden illnesses, and, most chillingly, sightings of men presumed dead wandering in nearby towns. What had once seemed like isolated oddities now coalesced into patterns too precise to ignore. Survivors, emboldened by the internal dissent, began leaking fragments of truth. A miner would speak to a relative, a clerk would hint at irregularities, and small pieces of the puzzle reached the wider community. These revelations were carefully managed, almost imperceptible, yet they ignited fear. Millbrook, long accustomed to the comforting authority of the church, suddenly faced the terrifying possibility that the institution itself, the sacred pillar of morality, had been a machinery of deceit. Families who had relied on Thompson's guidance now saw the shadows behind his sermons, the profit behind his charity, the manipulation behind his care. The psychological effect on the town was devastating. Panic and suspicion spread like wildfire. Ordinary interactions became exercises in caution, neighbors watched each other more closely, questioning stories that once required no scrutiny. Even the act of attending church became fraught with unease, as each ritual, every sermon, and every familiar face could conceal hidden agendas. Faith was weaponized, and now the weapon had been turned back on the faithful. Thompson responded with a mixture of deflection and reinforcement. He intensified the emotional power of sermons, highlighted his long record of service, and staged public acts of charity to drown out growing doubt. Yet the cracks had widened beyond repair. Rumors were now corroborated by first-hand accounts. The combination of survivor testimony, community observation, and internal dissent made it increasingly impossible for him to maintain the illusion of benevolence. By the late 1870s, Millbrook existed in a state of collective tension. Families no longer knew whom to trust, the lines between moral guidance, manipulation, and exploitation blurred. The Church of Empty Coffins was no longer merely a scandal, it had become a psychological battleground, a case study in how deeply authority could warp perception and how fragile trust becomes when deception is embedded in every layer of communal life. The final unraveling began with forensic scrutiny that Millbrook could neither ignore nor suppress. Authorities exhumed grave after grave, revealing the horrifying truth that each coffin was empty, substituted with stones and carefully arranged materials to mimic human weight. The meticulousness of the deception stunned investigators. Records matched the coffins, death certificates aligned with insurance claims, and yet every death had been a carefully staged illusion. The scale of exploitation, 255 victims over 15 years, was almost unimaginable. Public outrage erupted with a force that could not be contained. The community that had once revered Thompson as a savior now saw him as an architect of moral and human devastation. Families who had received insurance payouts grappled with a mixture of relief and horror. Their financial security had been built on the suffering, enslavement, and manipulation of loved ones. Survivors testified, their voices carrying the weight of trauma, detailing the minds, the labor, and the psychological torment they endured. Each account chipped away at any remaining facade of benevolence. Investigators documented the intricate coordination of the operation. Thompson orchestrated obedience through psychological conditioning, sermons, and ritualized ceremonies. Dr. Whitman selected victims under the guise of care. Crow perfected the illusion of death. Contractors transported the men to remote mining operations, where their labor became a silent, coerced commodity. Every step was deliberate, every interaction calculated, every ethical boundary obliterated. The Church of Empty Coffins had transformed grief into a machine, morality into a currency, and desperation into labor. The exposure reverberated far beyond Millbrook. Newspapers chronicled the scandal, framing it as both shocking and instructive. Other towns, previously unaware of similar methods, began investigating local clergy, labor brokers, and insurance programs. The psychological blueprint Thompson had perfected, exploiting trust, faith, and desperation, was now laid bare for the world to see, a chilling lesson in the depths of human manipulation and institutional corruption. Amid the chaos, Thompson attempted one final performance of control, public sermons pleading misunderstanding, invoking divine mission, and framing himself as a scapegoat for the industrial and social pressures of the era. Yet his words fell on ears hardened by revelation, minds awakened by evidence, and hearts no longer willing to surrender obedience. The Church of Empty Coffins could no longer hide behind ritual or rhetoric. Its legacy was fully exposed, a meticulously engineered system of control, exploitation, and moral corruption. The men transported to the remote mines were no longer James Morrison, Patrick Sullivan, or Benjamin Fletcher. Their names, histories, and identities had been stripped away, replaced with numbers and false records. Each day was a battle for survival, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of brutal labor in tunnels that seemed to stretch into the underworld itself. The air was thick with dust, choking lungs already weakened by disease. Tools were primitive, the timber supports rotten, the floors slick with coal dust and blood. Accidents were frequent, deaths inevitable, and yet the supervisors showed no sympathy. These were men already dead in the eyes of society. Their labor, their suffering, their very presence, was invisible beyond the perimeter of the mines. Some tried to resist, to assert fragments of identity. A whispered name in the darkness, a shared memory with a fellow miner, these were fragile threads clinging to sanity. But survival demanded obedience. Escape was impossible. The terrain was unfamiliar, isolated. Guards, complicit in the operation and paid for silence, monitored movements. Each attempt at defiance was met with punishment, extra labor, starvation rations, beatings designed to break both body and will. Yet even in such cruelty, small acts of humanity persisted, secret sharing of food, quiet comfort in the dark, the occasional letter smuggled to a relative under a false name. These men became shadows of themselves, yet fragments of conscience and memory refused to die. What made the system so devastating was not only the physical toll, but the psychological one. They had been pronounced dead. Their families had grieved. The world outside had moved on. In that silence, despair festered. They were ghosts in the land of the living, trapped in a nightmare constructed from trust, faith, and the cold calculation of men who wielded authority like a weapon. Every glance at the miners' faces, every skeleton-thin body dragging itself through the shafts, was a testament to the calculated cruelty of Thompson's enterprise. And yet, there was a method to their endurance. Thompson had ensured that payouts to families continued, reinforcing the illusion that the deceased were safely provided for. The miners knew their disappearance would never be questioned. The town believed the dead were gone. In this perverse balance, survival became both a physical and moral labyrinth. Those who endured the mines carried with them the dual weight of gratitude and resentment, the knowledge that they were both living sacrifices and victims of deception. By the late 1870s, whispers began to surface in Millbrook, glimpses of men who should have been dead, rumors that unsettled even the most trusting hearts. But these were rare, fleeting, and always dismissed as grief or imagination. The machinery continued, invisible yet absolute, consuming the desperate while society slept, oblivious. Even the most meticulously constructed systems leave traces, subtle imperfections that hint at the truth. In Millbrook, the first cracks appeared not through courage, but through curiosity and coincidence. A storekeeper noticed discrepancies in deliveries, orders supposedly paid by widows who claimed a husband had died weeks earlier, yet the men themselves appeared on the street, thin, unkempt, and distant. A few miners returned unexpectedly from neighboring towns, speaking of strange labor camps, their words halting, eyes darting, as if the shadows themselves had followed them home. Thomas McKenna was the first to voice suspicion. He had seen Morrison on the tracks and knew what he'd seen could not be reconciled with reality. He spoke cautiously, hesitant to appear insane, yet the need to understand gnawed at him. Other townspeople came forward in whispers, reporting sightings of the dead at distant locations. Each claim alone was dismissed: imagination, grief, coincidence. But patterns emerged, and the repetition could not be ignored. Something was deeply wrong, and it had been hidden in plain sight for over a decade. Reverend Thompson, sensing the first stirrings of doubt, tightened control. Sermons became more impassioned, emphasizing obedience, faith, and the mysterious ways of divine providence. Families were reminded of the comfort provided by the church, the assurance of payouts, and the spiritual necessity of trust. Simultaneously, Dr. Whitman worked to suppress anomalies, issuing new certificates, adjusting records, and silencing minor discrepancies before they escalated. Even Crow, the Undertaker, took extra care, ensuring no coffin, no service, and no rumor strayed beyond the illusion. Yet the system, for all its precision, relied on human compliance. Greed, fear, and desperation had been leveraged to perfection, but when ordinary men began questioning the reality around them, the machinery faltered. The miners in the mines grew restless, frustrated by impossible working conditions and the knowledge that the world above assumed them dead. Some attempted escape, only to vanish again, punished or returned, deepening the psychological terror. The first formal investigations began quietly. An insurance adjuster from Philadelphia questioned inconsistencies in claims, minor audits were conducted. Thompson's network bristled with tension. Each inquiry was met with rehearsed explanations, doctored records, and appeals to morality, faith, and providence. The outward appearance of a righteous church, a benevolent doctor, and a skilled undertaker remained intact, but beneath, the truth was fragile, teetering. By the end of the decade, Millbrook itself stood at a crossroads between faith and horror, trust and exposure. One wrong question, one skeptical observer, one surviving miner willing to speak, these were the seeds that would eventually unearth the 255 lives lost to a deception so complete, it defied belief. The first formal inquiry into St. Stephen's Church was subtle, almost cautious. In 1878, an insurance agent from Philadelphia arrived in Millbrook, initially under the guise of routine auditing. He reviewed records, checking premiums, payouts, and death certificates. At first, everything seemed in order: meticulous documentation, signatures, and the familiar imprimatur of Reverend Thompson's authority. But subtle anomalies began to emerge. Dates didn't align, names repeated in strange patterns, and some policies appeared to have been cashed multiple times. The agent noted discrepancies, filed reports, and quietly escalated concerns. Meanwhile, whispers in town grew louder. Families had begun noticing oddities, men supposedly dead appearing in distant towns, workers returned from mining operations claiming strange labor conditions, and inconsistencies between death certificates and funeral observations. Each incident alone could be dismissed. Combined, they began forming a troubling picture. Someone, was manipulating the very fabric of life and death in Millbrook. Authorities finally moved to exhume graves. The first coffin was opened with a sense of ritual unease. Stones. Nothing else. No bones, no remains. Shock rippled through the inspection team. Each subsequent grave revealed the same haunting pattern, weighted stones arranged meticulously to simulate a human body. As the coffins were lifted, the eerie precision became apparent. Crow's craftsmanship was undeniable. The deception was surgical, almost artistic, yet horrifying in intent. Every burial, every funeral, every grief-stricken widow had been complicit in illusion without knowledge. Investigators began to trace the financial transactions. Hundreds of insurance payouts had flowed from Keystone Mutual Assurance to families, facilitated entirely through the church. Thompson had orchestrated every step: documentation, burial, disbursement. Dr. Whitman's role was undeniable, providing medical certificates that claimed death where life persisted. Crow's handiwork turned each grave into a convincing lie. The town's trust had been weaponized, grief monetized, and lives converted into a hidden labor force. The authorities realized the scope was staggering. It was not a crime of desperation but a carefully planned, sustained enterprise spanning 15 years. Men had been declared dead, buried, transported, and forced into near slavery in distant mines, all while their families believed they were receiving divine providence in compensation. The church, the doctor, and the Undertaker formed a triumvirate of control, trust, and deception, exploiting both law and faith to create an invisible empire of human lives. By the time the inquiry was fully underway, the town of Millbrook was reeling. Families who had mourned and accepted divine providence now confronted the unimaginable truth: their loved ones might still live, or had lived under conditions so cruel, so systematic, that comprehension itself strained the mind. And yet, the machinery of deception had been designed to withstand scrutiny, relying on fear, faith, and human psychological limits to survive exposure. When the investigation became public, St. Stephen's Church did not crumble immediately. Thompson was a master manipulator, skilled in rhetoric, projection, and the use of authority as armor. He framed the inquiry as an attack on faith itself, portraying inspectors as outsiders, greedy bureaucrats, or skeptics bent on undermining the moral order. Sermons grew more impassioned, almost theatrical, appealing to loyalty, devotion, and the sanctity of belief. Families were subtly coerced into silence, reminded that challenging the church was tantamount to questioning God. Fear and reverence intertwined, creating a social web that isolated dissenters. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Coffins filled with stones, falsified death certificates, and witnesses who had seen the dead alive in distant towns could no longer be ignored. The authorities began piecing together the human conveyor belt Thompson had engineered: terminally ill men identified by Whitman, coffins prepared by Crow, funerals orchestrated with psychological precision, insurance payouts delivered, and victims transported to remote mines where mortality was a constant companion. The web extended further than most imagined. Payments flowed from church funds to contractors, from contractors to mining operators. The operation was systematic, industrial in scope, and designed to erase accountability at every step. Some townspeople attempted to resist. A few families, desperate to know the truth about missing loved ones, tried to locate miners, report anomalies, or confront the church directly. They were met with intimidation, subtle threats, and social ostracization. Thompson understood the power of perception: a single brave witness could unravel everything, so loyalty and fear were meticulously maintained. Even within the investigation, officials had to tread carefully. The church's authority was real, its influence deep, and its ability to sway public sentiment formidable. Public pressure, however, grew. Newspapers picked up fragments of the story: Millbrook mystery, the dead who walked, but details were scarce, obscured by legal maneuvering and public fear. The psychological toll on the town was immense. Families who had believed in divine justice were confronted with betrayal on every level, spiritual, moral, and legal. The sense of security provided by the church had been weaponized. Faith itself had been converted into a tool of manipulation. By the end of the decade, the facade could no longer hold. Thompson's sermons, once a source of comfort, became weapons of defense. Whitman retreated under scrutiny, Crow's reputation teetered on the edge of ruin, and the system they had perfected, 15 years in the making, was beginning to collapse. The first glimpses of justice, however incomplete, were appearing, and the machinery of disappearance that had consumed over 200 lives began to be exposed in terrifying clarity. Even the most meticulously constructed empires are vulnerable to whispers, and for Thompson, those whispers began in the shadows of St. Stephen's pews. A widow noticed her husband, supposedly deceased, walking the streets of a neighboring town. A miner recognized a comrade who had been buried months before. At first, these observations were dismissed as grief-driven illusions, the desperate mind playing cruel tricks. But as the reports accumulated, an unsettling pattern emerged, a mosaic of sightings that could no longer be explained away by coincidence or imagination. Rumors spread cautiously, whispered at the edges of gatherings, behind closed doors, or in the dim glow of candlelit homes. Each account was treated with skepticism, yet each carried a subtle truth that threatened Thompson's carefully maintained facade. Parishioners who had trusted him implicitly began to question, how could so many deaths align so precisely with insurance payouts? How could faith and fortune intertwine with such cruel regularity? Fear of social ostracization initially kept people silent, but doubt, once planted, grows relentlessly, feeding on every unexplained shadow, every vanished man, every empty coffin. Thompson, ever perceptive, responded preemptively. He intensified his sermons, emphasizing obedience, divine providence, and the dangers of questioning God's will. He framed doubt as moral weakness, suspicion as sin, and skepticism as rebellion. Yet cracks persisted. Private letters surfaced, documenting accounts of miraculous survivals and anomalous observations. Some parishioners began conducting discreet investigations, comparing records, cross-checking deaths, and noting discrepancies that could no longer be reconciled with ordinary misfortune. The tension within Millbrook grew palpable. Families whose members had been transported under the Millbrook method wrestled with conflicting realities, relief that loved ones were alive, horror at the conditions endured, and outrage at the manipulation they had been subjected to. Conversations shifted from mourning to moral reckoning, from compliance to subtle defiance. Thompson's network, once unassailable, was showing vulnerabilities. Even his allies, the doctor, the Undertaker, the Contractors, felt the pressure, aware that exposure would not only ruin them financially but could also ignite retribution from a community scorned and betrayed. By the time the first formal complaints reached authorities, Thompson's empire was beginning to unravel, not through law, but through the insistent force of awareness. Suspicion became evidence, whispers became corroborated accounts, and doubt transformed into a collective questioning that no sermon could silence. For the first time, the Church of Empty Coffins faced a threat it had never encountered, the unflinching gaze of a town unwilling to remain complicit in the invisible machinery of death and deception. The first formal investigations began quietly, almost surreptitiously, as local authorities received complaints from the uneasy and the observant. Letters detailing discrepancies in burial records, reports of miners supposedly dead yet alive, and suspicions of falsified certificates began to accumulate on desks in the county office. Yet the legal machinery was slow, unpracticed in confronting a crime that spanned morality, religion, and industrial exploitation. Investigators faced a labyrinth of deception, where every lead was obscured by ritual, paperwork, and the unshakable authority of Reverend Thompson. Thompson responded with calculated precision. He leveraged his standing in the community, his reputation for charity, and his carefully curated image of moral authority to cast doubt on every complaint. He framed the investigators as misinformed or overzealous, appealing to clergy, influential families, and local press to defend his integrity. At the same time, he orchestrated subtle intimidation, reminders of debts owed, social ostracization for dissenters, and veiled warnings that questioning divine work could lead to personal ruin. The system of manipulation that had ensnared the miners and families above ground now extended to those tasked with enforcing justice. Dr. Whitman and Samuel Crowe were equally cautious. The physician claimed procedural adherence and the moral imperative of aiding families, framing his role as a necessary bridge between life, death, and survival. Crowe, with his expertise in funerary deception, remained silent, knowing that exposure could destroy not only his livelihood but his life. Meanwhile, the network of contractors who transported the living dead operated in the shadows, invisible and untraceable, ensuring that evidence remained scarce, fragmented, and almost impossible to compile. The investigators' frustration grew. Every visit to St. Stephen's, every attempt to verify records, every query to families seemed to encounter resistance or obfuscation. Parishioners, bound by faith, fear, and social pressure, defended Thompson even as suspicion gnawed at them. The investigative process became a psychological chess game. Thompson controlled perception, delayed disclosure, and manipulated social dynamics to maintain the facade. It was a battle not just of law and evidence, but of influence, obedience, and the malleability of human belief. Despite the obstacles, the first undeniable cracks emerged. Cross-referenced accounts of survivors, conflicting burial records, and witness testimonies began to paint a coherent, but horrifying, picture. Authorities could no longer ignore that the Church of Empty Coffins was not merely negligent or morally compromised, but the hub of a system designed to exploit trust, grief, and desperation for profit and control. The unmasking of Thompson's operation had begun, and the very structures he had weaponized, faith, fear, and obedience, were turning against him. Thompson's control extended far beyond logistics and finance. It penetrated the very minds of his congregation through a system of symbols, rituals, and subtle psychological cues. Every element of St. Stephen's, from the cadence of sermons to the arrangement of pews, the placement of candles, and even the timing of funerals, was designed to elicit emotional responses that reinforced obedience. The environment itself became a tool, conditioning parishioners to associate authority with safety, grief with moral duty, and fear with divine purpose. Sermons were carefully constructed psychological operations. Thompson used repetition, rhythm, and metaphor to implant ideas that bypassed rational critique. Words like sacrifice, providence, and divine will were repeated until the congregation associated compliance with spiritual elevation. Emotional intensity, combined with controlled pacing and pauses, created a hypnotic effect. Listeners left the pews not merely comforted, but subtly reshaped in perception and expectation. Questions about procedure or morality were interpreted not as curiosity, but as spiritual weakness, deterring dissent at the subconscious level. Funerals were the apex of this conditioning. Crowe's weighted coffins, the dim lighting, the solemn music, and Thompson's authoritative voice formed a multisensory experience that imprinted obedience on memory. Ritualized gestures, kneeling, crossing oneself, responding at designated cues, reinforce social cohesion and trust in authority while numbing critical thought. Families, emotionally exhausted by grief, were highly suggestible. The ceremony itself became a behavioral anchor, teaching them to accept deception as both comforting and morally correct. Even the smallest details mattered. The placement of insurance pamphlets beside Bibles, the timing of announcements immediately following emotionally charged prayers, the subtle signaling between Thompson, Whitman, and Crowe, all reinforced the illusion of divine orchestration. Observers unconsciously learned to interpret authority as benevolence, instruction as morality, and obedience as sacred. The psychological framework ensured that even as suspicions arose, parishioners doubted themselves before questioning the system. This mastery of environmental and behavioral cues illustrates the terrifying sophistication of Thompson's operation. Obedience was not coerced, it was cultivated. Perception was shaped to render exploitation invisible. By embedding psychological conditioning into every aspect of church life, Thompson ensured that the machinery of deception could operate with minimal resistance, leaving even the most intelligent and devoted individuals vulnerable to manipulation. The success of Thompson's empire depended not only on psychological manipulation but also on the complicity of those entrusted with care, most notably Dr. Cornelius Whitman. Presented as a benevolent physician, Whitman occupied a dual role, healer to the community and architect of the medical justification for the Millbrook method. His examinations, ostensibly for preventive care, became a covert selection process. Every cough, ailment, and injury was evaluated not only for treatment but for potential suitability for the mines, the hidden labor system, and insurance exploitation. Whitman's authority carried weight precisely because he embodied trust. Parishioners believed that a physician's word was final, that diagnosis equated truth, that care equaled protection. Thompson leveraged this trust. When a miner received a terminal prognosis, Whitman framed the insurance scheme as both practical and ethical, a choice of sacrifice for the family's welfare. The ethical ambiguity was thin, yet compelling. The family benefited, the worker survived physically, and yet, unknowingly, he was condemned to slavery-like labor. By cloaking coercion in professional expertise, Whitman normalized the unimaginable. Other professionals contributed in subtler ways. Clerks, contractors, and social organizers who interacted with parishioners maintained the illusion of legitimacy. Their roles, though minor individually, collectively reinforced Thompson's moral and institutional cover. Each signature, each letter, each procedural form was another layer of authority that obscured the underlying horror. Families were not only deceived, they were educated to trust the system, to interpret it as benevolent, and to participate unwittingly in their own manipulation. The complicity extended to moral rationalization. Dr. Whitman and other allies framed the Millbrook method as pragmatic and even virtuous, exploiting cultural narratives about duty, sacrifice, and providence. By aligning human exploitation with morality, they neutralized resistance. Obedience became synonymous with righteousness, questioning became sinful, and survival required acquiescence. The machinery of deception was, therefore, not merely physical or economic, it was deeply moral, entangling conscience with complicity. The brilliance and horror of the system lay in this convergence. Spiritual authority, professional legitimacy, and social coordination worked as one. Thompson, Whitman, and their network created an ecosystem where exploitation was invisible, obedience was voluntary, and deception was codified into the fabric of everyday life. Victims were never forced, they were guided, nudged, and morally persuaded into submission. And it worked because it leveraged what humans most fear and desire: security, belonging, and the illusion of doing right by family and God. After the public exposure of Thompson's operation, Millbrook entered a period of uneasy reckoning. Legal actions dismantled parts of the network, Crow was removed from his position, some insurance claims were voided, and Thompson faced charges of fraud and conspiracy. Dr. Whitman retreated under scrutiny, his practice permanently tarnished. Yet the human machinery he had helped design, transportation, exploitation, and concealment of the living dead, was not entirely eradicated. Contractors and mining operators had learned the methods, and while the system no longer operated openly under church authority, the framework for manipulation remained, hidden in the shadows of Pennsylvania's industrial corridors. Survivors attempted to rebuild their lives, but the legacy of manipulation persisted. Many could not return to their previous trades or communities, carrying both physical scars from mine labor and psychological scars from deception. Families who had once relied on faith and trust now questioned every institution, every authority figure. The lesson was brutal and clear: devotion and desperation could be weaponized, and the consequences could outlive even the perpetrators. Millbrook had survived, but the town itself had been altered forever, a microcosm of how systematic exploitation could corrode the moral and social foundations of a community. Interestingly, some of Thompson's tactics persisted, subtly and invisibly. Exploitation of human desperation, leveraging trust for profit, and the construction of illusions under the guise of moral or spiritual authority were practices that would echo in other towns and industries. Historians later noted that similar mechanisms appeared in early labor recruitment schemes across Pennsylvania, suggesting that the Millbrook method, while exposed, had left a blueprint for human exploitation beyond the church's walls. These were the shadows of Thompson's genius, a terrifying reminder that systems designed for control rarely vanish entirely, even when exposed. Millbrook's collective psyche remained fragile. Generations grew up hearing whispers of the Church of Empty Coffins, tales that blurred between fact and myth, yet embedded a persistent wariness of authority. The survivor stories became oral cautionary legends, imparted with a mix of awe and horror. Children learned that trust must be earned, that appearances can deceive, and that moral authority can be manipulated with surgical precision. Even as the scandal faded from newspapers, the psychological and social echoes continued. the town had witnessed what happens when faith, desperation, and human cunning intersect, a calculated system that transformed grief into profit and obedience into enslavement. Awareness, once awakened, became the only armor against the repetition of such horrors. Those who understood the Millbrook method carried a permanent, chilling insight: humanity can be both the victim and the instrument of its own exploitation. Thompson's genius lay not only in logistics but in the psychological architecture of control. Every sermon, every ritual, every funeral was a meticulously crafted tool to manipulate perception and emotion. The congregation believed they were witnessing divine providence, but in reality, they were being conditioned to accept deception as moral and inevitable. Grief became a weapon, awe became a leash, and devotion became complicity. Each act reinforced a narrative that transformed suspicion into reverence, fear into obedience. Funerals were the apex of this psychological engineering. Crows' coffins, weighted and prepared to simulate human bodies, were presented with solemnity and precision. Thompson's voice, commanding yet comforting, delivered messages of sacrifice and divine mystery. He spoke of the righteous path, of the beauty in trusting unseen providence, of the necessity of faith even when understanding failed. Families, exhausted by grief, were emotionally vulnerable, and Thompson's manipulation exploited that vulnerability with clinical accuracy. The rituals did not merely conceal truth, they ingrained submission, creating a town trained to accept lies as salvation. Health seminars and insurance meetings extended this influence. Dr. Whitman presented medical assessments as acts of care, while subtly categorizing the vulnerable for eventual processing. Every interaction, whether counseling a widow, examining a minor, or orchestrating a funeral, served a dual purpose: comfort the living, and prepare the vulnerable for exploitation. Even the most skeptical congregants were drawn into a network of authority, ritual, and obligation so intertwined that questioning it felt sacrilegious. Thompson also understood the power of narrative repetition. Tales of miraculous insurance payouts, stories of men who had sacrificed for their families, and the visual spectacle of funerals reinforced moral imperatives that justified extreme action. Cognitive dissonance became a tool: families reconciled grief and relief, horror and gratitude, obedience and morality, creating a psychological environment where exploitation could thrive unnoticed. What made this manipulation so effective was its invisibility. People believed they were acting out of morality and faith, yet their compliance served a calculated agenda. Trust became the mechanism of control, grief became the medium, and authority became the instrument. The Church of Empty Coffins was not merely a site of crime, it was a laboratory in human psychology, a study in how devotion, fear, and carefully curated illusion could engineer consent for unimaginable acts.